Okay, we're going to be spending a fair amount of time on this subject, mainly because it's a central part of all the research I do, and I'm interested in it. So therefore, we're going to spend more time on it. That's not particularly a good reason, but it's good enough for me. So in that context, there's several things you have to remember when you're looking at religion, especially from the point of view of anthropologists. Um, Religion is universal. As far as we know, every group has some form of religious belief system. Having said that, religions and beliefs are not unique to cultures. There are a number of world religions, Christianity being an example, that cross over from culture to culture. Having said that, in fact, Catholicism is a good example. You can have a belief system that is in a number of different places, but it very frequently gets tweaked so that it doesn't look the same. If you look at Catholicism practiced in, say, in Italy, there's some real radical differences between that and Catholicism practiced, say, in Mexico, or say even in the Philippines. It's all part of the same religion, the same theology. But in terms of actual on-the-ground practices and the way that people who are believers interpret and use the religion, there's a tremendous amount of variety. So religions are very, very complicated. And the best way to get into religion is to remember the basic definition of it. And that comes from the best definition that's the cleanest one, especially for anthropologists. Since we're not only looking at other cultures, but remember we're trying to interpret other cultures or translate other cultures. If you're going to do that, first off the bat as an anthropologist, you have to accept that whatever the belief system those folks have is legit. So one of the things in anthropology, this is that insider-outsider approach. You have to try to understand what that religion or belief system does for those people. You've also got to back away from your own religious or belief systems and not score them based on your attitudes. Religion is one of the easiest ways to be ethnocentric because we're firmly convinced that our religion is, our relationship with the divine or whatever cosmology we've got. And so therefore, when we see people doing something different, there's immediate attitude, oh, these poor buggers, they don't have a clue, or, what a bizarre thing to do. And that at that point, you're not being an anthropologist anymore. At that point, you can't be an anthropologist because to those people looking at you, they see you in exactly the same way. So it's important to remember that despite the protestation of universalistic religions like Christianity, Islam, etc., that they have the word, the fact that you have such an enormous diversity of religions globally in all sorts of ways, shapes, and forms, you have to accept, at least intellectually, that there are other ways that are equally legitimate that are being practiced by that group of people. Your job then is to both understand them, see what that religion does for those people. In other words, what does it do? And what do they expect the religion to do? And then try to explain that to people who don't have that insight. And this is oftentimes very difficult because most folks' actual consumption of the religious system is both very superficial and very, very complex. In other words, it varies not only from group to group within the culture, but also from individuals in the group. So the easiest way to look at this is go back to Durkheim's original discussion, back to Emile Durkheim. We're in France in the 19th century. They're building the Eiffel Tower, and what happens when they start to build it is people start jumping off of it. So it's like 1/3 constructed, only like the bottom part's finished, and people are already climbing up in there and jumping off. Now this becomes a major source of it. In a sort of weird way, people start to think this is sort of like a trip. So what you get is people going out there to wait and see if someone going to Saturday, is someone going to jump, commit suicide. So this became a huge discussion, and because there weren't a lot of large, sort of massive iron structures at the time, one of the things that became very popular, since mesmerism, or we now think hypnotism, was in vogue at the time, was that somehow this huge iron mass was actually grabbing vulnerable people and whispering to their heads, "Climb up me and jump, climb up on me and jump." So there's a real, popularistic idea that somehow the tower was responsible for the increase in suicide rates. French don't tend to suicide a lot, in part because their Catholic upbringing, also the idea of the relevance of family and the idea of what people will say. So suicide's not really generally acceptable in France. So I have a relatively low suicide rate. So what was happening related to the Eiffel Tower and the suicide rate in that part of Paris was way out of whack with the norm. So it was getting a huge amount of discussion at the time. In that, Durkheim, the French sort of anthro-sociologist, becomes really interested in what's causing this. And so one of the things he realizes very quickly you have to look at is if you're going to try to figure out, okay, here you've got a list of people that have either tried to commit suicide or have suicided successfully from this place. One is you can't really, there's no way to measure what the tower is doing. So you just sort of discount that as a possibility. Then what you have to try to do is try to figure out what are the common factors of the people that are attracted to doing something off of that tower. Is there some common thread that ties them all together? And not surprisingly, since you're talking about the taking of life, is not surprisingly as immediately one thing that popped into his head is, well, is this somehow tied to religious beliefs? Are these people part of some sort of religious belief that believes that suicide is okay, or something? So it's one of the first things he starts to track down is what's the relationship with that? He very quickly realizes in urban Paris, and you have to remember Paris in the 19th century was very possibly the most cosmopolitan city in the world. The French Empire, like the British Empire, was global. More than the British, the French are very into sort of conceptual ideas and stuff like that. So what you found was a lot of people doing a lot of strange stuff, and there were a lot of really, really different religions in the area of metropolitan Paris that were going on at the time. So once he starts to look into this, he realizes that crap, there's just a ton of religions in the city, and all these people, are different. There isn't any pattern to it. He realizes that before he figures out what they're doing, he has to figure out what's religion. Because it also becomes very complicated. If, for example, you pay a gypsy to look into a crystal ball and tell you your future, is that religion or is it something else? So the more he comes into this, he realizes that he has to actually come up with a fundamental way of describing what religion is that will apply to all the diversity you see in a place like Paris in 1870, 1880, before you're going to try to figure out if you've got religion as a common factor in this situation. And what he comes up with is basically the principle we still use in anthropology today for the definition of religion. And it's basically got two parts. One is the premise that people need to have a sense of understanding that there's a reason for existence. Okay, they have to, if you want to think of it this way, they have to think that there's some reason to get up in the morning. There's some reason to do what you're supposed to do. In that context, then basically the world divides itself into two categories. One category, and I'm going to have to use the French because French and English really don't share a lot of concepts, and these are particularly French concepts. There's the boringly normal. If you touch something that's hot, you'll get burned. If you go outside and it's raining, you'll get wet. Okay, that's the stuff people have experienced in their life, and so they understand it, know it, and it's predictable. In French, that's called the profane. The English word the closest would be the word normal or mundane. So the things that are normal or mundane that we acquire through our own personal experience, no religion deals with those things, because we can make sense of that part of the world simply by our own personal observations and life experience. Having said that, what Durkheim very quickly realized is there's a whole chunk of things that happen to us and around us that aren't subject to observation. A good friend of mine, for example, was one of the state counselors for people dealing with terminal illness in hospitals. So she would sit there literally and watch people die in hospital beds, one person after another. She was doing this for years. She probably saw more people end than anyone else I know of. More so than the family members, because they might only have one family member this happens to. So she saw a lot of people ending their existence or their existence ending. She has no more insight now into what happens when you die than she did when she started that job. The idea of why were you born, why were you born, where and to whom you were born? Why does something happen to you that comes out of the blue? What happens when you die? Why do you have to die? All these type of questions that aren't subject to observation and testing. In other words, you can't test to get an answer. You can't do some sort of a statistical run to see what the answer is going to be. Durkheim said that whatever in that particular society they see as those things that aren't explainable by observation, he called the sacré, which really doesn't translate in English into the word sacred. It translates into English in sort of the other than normal. So he said the world divides itself into two categories. There's the normal that you can study and observe and make explanations to your own comfort. There's also that chunk of stuff that doesn't fit that. He said religions, because people have this need to make sense of the world around them, to make sense that the world has a meaning, that there's a reason to getting up. He said that people have this part of the world they don't understand. That's the construct of religion. Religion belief systems make sense of the world that you cannot understand through observation and experience. And if you look at religion that way, then all of a sudden, all the diversity in world religions makes sense. It also is important to remember in that concept that all these religions work equally well as long as people believe their explanation for the things that they can't explain. So religions explain the unexplainable. Okay, what's explainable, that's the normal. And religions don't deal with that. You know, I don't know of any religion that ever has talked about if you're walking outside and you get wet because you don't have an umbrella, the why you get wet part. Why it rains at that particular time, sure, some religions deal with that, some don't, because that's considered something that's out of your control possibly. But the getting wet part, that's just, you know, that's just observation in life. So religions always deal with what in the French would be called the sacré, which just means that it's not subject to explanation. In that context, then one of the things he found out as one of the side benefits is all of a sudden anything that dealt with that becomes equally part of a religious belief system. Now, for example, in France and a lot of other places where you find a lot of Catholics, they have St. Christopher's medals are very popular. St. Christopher, one, is not a saint. And two, he's not part of the Catholic belief system. In other words, the Catholic Church doesn't see St. Christopher medals and St. Christopher as being part of their system. Catholics in much of the world do. So the people that practice the religion see that as being part of Catholicism. The actual bureaucracy of the Catholic Church doesn't. So, you know, if you were being technically religious and like you teach in a religion class, St. Christopher's medals wouldn't be religious. But for the people that wear them, since it protects them from evil, or I can't remember what it protects you from, in that context, it does fit Durkheim's definition because it's dealing with something that's a sacré, something that's beyond explanation. So going back to the asking some gypsy lady, you know, or some Romany lady to tell you your fortune in a crystal ball, that would be religious in the sense that you're dealing with something that you cannot subject to observation. You can't study your future now and get an answer. You have to look for something else from it. So someone that checks their astrology chart, you know, every morning when they go online or something like that, someone that you know, is in some of the way dealing with good luck charms, for example, all those would be part of what Durkheim called the sacré. Now, this is really important because this fits much more with what anthropologists sees. Because if you look at it, say, what we teach in a religion class, that's what you oftentimes call structured, text-based world religions. So they're very structured, very organized. There's, you know, a central text, and there's a set of beliefs, and ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. But if you actually look at the people in terms of what they actually do, you frequently find that there's a whole mess of other stuff that they consider religious that's not part of that formal religion. And the job of anthropology is to explain culture. The job of anthropology isn't to explain formal religions. That's someone who studies religions. So in that context, what we look at is the function of religious belief systems. And that's where Durkheim's definition is so absolutely fantastic, because it gives you a real good insight into why people have what they have, and why people use it the way they use it and see it as having value in the way that they do. Now, one of the side effects of this is that Durkheim pointed out, if an individual ends up in a situation where they start to question their belief system, in other words, they don't feel that, you know, this religion belief system was giving them explanations. We'll say that the world around changes. This happened here in Hawaii in the 19th century. So if you're Hawaiian and the old belief systems that you had, that the four gods, Tu, Tane, Tane, Loa, and Rono, were somehow responsible for everything, but that isn't explaining the world that you see in 1860, for example, then what's going to happen is you're going to try to find another set of beliefs. You're not going to give up on religion. The number of people who are really agnostic is very, very small. The number of people who don't believe in formal religions is actually pretty good size, but in a weird way, that actually becomes another belief system. So what happens for these folks here that give up on this, you know, traditional Hawaiian belief is they look for another religion, or another belief system that will put them back to the point where they have a new set of beliefs. So one of the fascinating aspects of religious belief systems is that, one, they're incredibly durable because they're held in people's minds. They're belief systems. They're not objects. They're not things. But on the other hand, they're also sort of like a beautiful thing made in glass. They're incredibly strong. But if the person who's the believer ceases to believe, then poof, the religion can just disappear overnight. And this is one of the reasons why you see major religions literally vanish in very short periods of time. And it's basically, it's internal imploding. The population basically says, not, you know, we don't buy it anymore. And poof, the religion's gone. On the other hand, groups from the outside can basically say, you can't practice this anymore. And that religion can go on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, in hiding, because the believers still believe. So religions are based in belief, and the function of religion, the belief system, is basically to give you answers to give you comfort about the things that you cannot explain given your own life experience. So that's religion. That's Durkheim's discussion of that. We're going to animate some later time. So when I talk about cosmology, cosmology is basically the way that you place your belief system and your entire understanding of the universe around you. So cosmology is always based on the person. I would have my cosmology and any of you would have your cosmology. It might not be the same as anyone else's, but it's always going to be with you in the center and your explanation of your entire belief universe, if you want to think of it that way, including the things that are both mundane or profane and the things that are other than explanation or secular. So cosmology is basically the entire package of all that stuff. Okay. Religions basically come in three forms, and by here we're talking structured religions. The ones that we're most familiar with, because Chaminade is a Catholic campus, is the idea of universalistic religions. Now, universalistic religions, don't say that fast 3 times, basically have one common premise. That common premise is that anyone that's considered human, anyone's considered a human being, has the potential to be part of the religion. And that's why we call it universalistic. It's not specific to a group or a place. Almost invariably what you find then is that in a universalistic religion, there will be an assumption that you can change people from whatever belief system they have to this universalistic religion, because if they're a human being, they should buy into your religion. You have to remember that Chaminade is a Catholic Marianist university, and one of its main functions is to missionize Christianity, Catholicism. Now, we do it by example, which is actually sort of a more Buddhist way of doing it. So rather than going and pounding on people's doors and giving them pamphlets and yelling at them to make them, change to your religion, you provide a role model, and by virtue of the things you do, people go, wow, that's nice and that's good, and maybe there's something in this belief system. So you try to do it by appropriate attractive behaviors, if you want to think of it. But universalistic religions have as their basic premise, and part of the push is that everyone who is a potential member should become a member, which means, one, that you have to educate them so that they have the ability to be part of that group, and two, and especially with conservative or fundamentalist groups, is if you're not willing to be a part but you have been exposed to it, then something should be done to you. This is why you see so much terrorism globally is tied to religion, whether it be Jewish terrorism or Islamic terrorism or Christian terrorism or whatever, Buddhist terrorism, whatever it is. And trust me, all these groups have in the past and still exhibit behaviors where basically if someone's been offered your universalistic religion and they don't accept it, then you get rid of them. And there's all sorts of logics behind that, not the least of which, if you kill them, then they're going to go maybe and get your religion when they die. So universalistic religions tend to be very aggressive. They tend to be not tolerant because their tolerance isn't built into a universalistic religion. Universalistic religions can't accept another religion as being equally good as themselves. They are the only word of whatever explanation they have of their religious belief system. So that would be the missionaries coming over here in 1821, bringing Protestant, Calvinism to the Hawaiians, with the idea of bringing this universalistic religion into a place which didn't have it, and therefore with the intent of, quote, saving Hawaiian souls. And also by virtue of definition, just making them a part of that religion. So universalistic religions all are very similar. Their actual theological argument is very different, but the basic premise is exactly the same, which is one reason why they crash into each other all the time. Think of the Crusades. You have, aggressive Islam on one hand, aggressive Christianity on the other hand, so you go out and you pick fights all across, parts of Europe for the purpose of proving your religion is superior. And if the other guy won't do it, then you kill him. Modern terrorism in the 21st century, same thing. Religious intolerance is a big part of universalistic religions. Now, having said that, there's a lot of other ways religions work. And in fact, here in Hawaii, a good example would be the traditional Hawaiian belief system. In the traditional Hawaiian belief system, which is tied to ancestors, your relationship to the divine, to basically your religious belief system, is through your genealogy, your family heritage. In that context, if I'm part of the owl mole, the owl sort of lizard, snake, dragon, god thing. That in that context, that's a result of who I'm born of. So those particular entities back in time made me, or made the people who I come from, I'm just descended from. So my relationship with religion is very peculiarly tied to my heritage, my genealogy. In that context, there's no particular reason for me to walk down the street down here and say 6th Avenue and start banging on people's doors and say, hey, you got to believe. Because as far as I'm concerned, the only people who are actually part of my religion are the people who share the same genealogy as me. And if you're not my relative, then why would I care what you think? Now, if you notice one of the side effects of this, I might not actually see you as a human being. Remember, I talked about this when I was talking about clans. Because my view of the real people very likely is only the people who have the same ancestor as I do. So in that way, my religion system is actually quite small. And there's certainly no room for bringing in others. There's no way that I could be a missionary. You know, what would you missionize? Why would you even talk to people who aren't part of the same system? These are what we call ethnic or particularistic religions. So what you had was an ethnic particularistic religious system here, and the New England missionaries bring in a universalistic religion on top of that. So that's why you see the complexities of modern religious beliefs, for example, with Hawaiians, part Hawaiians here in the 21st century, is the mishmash of these different universalistic overlays on top of what originally was a very particularistic belief system, which wasn't subject to export. If you think about it, the missionaries come from New England here to bring religion. You never hear of Hawaiians taking Hawaiian religion and going to New England to missionize in Boston, because the Hawaiian religious system was not subject to export. It wasn't something you could convince people who are different to believe in it, because what would there be to tell them? Third form is syncretic. This would be true of many of the forms of Buddhism that you see, for example, in much of East Asia. If we go to, we're doing our work in, for example, the Xi'an in central China, what you find is the vast majority of the population there is Buddhist, but also they're Taoist. So they actually do two religions at the same time. You see this a lot if you go to someplace like Hong Kong, where you find people will go to Buddhist temples for some things and they'll go to Taoist temples for other stuff. They have no problem with the two religions being combined. So they actually have two separate belief systems that they've sort of co-logicked in their own view of the world. And that's because in part Taoism doesn't care. And it's also because in part most forms of Buddhism actually see other religions as manifestations, legitimate manifestations of religion. Buddhism is sort of unique in modern universalistic world religions now, in that it tends to be inclusive rather than exclusivity. So that's what we call syncretic, where you have two belief systems tied together. Probably the most striking example of this that's easily accessible would be Japanese society, where you have very much the same system. You have people are Buddhist for some things. For other things, they're Shinto, which is the Japanese traditional sort of folk religion. So for example, if you get married in Japan, that's a Shinto ceremony. When you're born and when you die, and for other sort of life-changing events, that's usually a Buddhist ceremony. If you want to pray that your kids get good grades in school, or if your daughter has a son or something like that, you go to a Shinto shrine. So people have no problem going to different places for different types of stuff, for different purposes, for different needs. But they're all dealing with this idea of the unexplainable. So syncretic religions are the third form, which is the idea that you can actually have a melding of religions. And usually what happens is divide the unexplained things into different categories. In Japan, for example, Buddhism deals with life and death. Shinto deals with stuff that happens when you're living. So they've sort of broken up the issues that people have into two categories. One religion stakes out a claim in one area, the other religion stakes out a claim in the other area. And in that context, that syncretic relationship gives people a nice structure of their religious belief systems that allow them to deal with the stuff that they can't make sense of. One of the ways you frequently see this is because religions very, very much, especially if they're religions tied to a particular culture, they come out of a cultural context, are one of the best ways to control behavior. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If, for example, you're one of the big universalistic religions, you're Muslim or you're Christian, then in the particular population you're a part of, there's got to be some sort of system of control of behavior. So you're supposed to act normatively. In other words, you're supposed to do what the group says you're supposed to do. But, most of the time, there's not going to be anyone there to monitor your behavior. Or if they do, they don't know exactly who you are. Think of going down the freeway faster than the speed limit. Unless you get really unlucky, no one ever drives the speed limit on H1. If you did, you'd probably get rear-ended by some guy behind you. So everyone's going faster than they're supposed to. So no one's following. On one hand, you have the rule, but the normative value is you're supposed to go, whatever you're supposed to go to keep up with traffic around you. Now, if you want to have control of that, then you could either have cops with radar guns who occasionally catch people, but then people are just going to think they're lucky because they got caught. 99% of the drivers are going to do whatever they want to do. So you don't really have a normative control by people of most behavior, because you just can't put the people in positions where they can see the behavior that they're supposed to control. So what you do is instead of doing it that way, you give that the function of religion. So what you do is in the religious system, that's where you place your controls. So for example, if you do enough bad stuff, you're not going to get to heaven in the Christian theological sense, or in the Islamic sense, you're not going to go to paradise. So what you do is you now have things in heaven or things in paradise, whether it be angels or whatever, that are monitoring human behavior. So you don't need a policeman. What you've got is an angel or some sort of God spirit that's actually watching what you do. You can't hide stuff from them. You can't, check to see if they got their radar gun out. They're there monitoring you all the time. This is a much more effective way to make people behave. And especially because the threat is so terrifying, because the threat has to do with this unexplainable. If you piss this thing off or you do what you're not supposed to do, it's going to whack you in the areas that aren't explainable. It's going to make your life a misery. It's going to mean you don't get to heaven, whatever it might be. It's not stuff that you can, bribe someone for, get out of it, or have a good lawyer. And that means that people are much more liable to behave if the morality is tied to the religious system than they are if it's just like a legal code or some sort of standard of behavior that people are doing. People enforcement is always a failure in terms of normative behavior. Religiously belief-based control of behavior, that works. I mean, that's really effective, and that's one of the things that religions do, is they keep people in line, to keep people behaving the way the group wants them to. And this is why when you look at universalistic religions, and they're in different places, Catholicism in Italy versus Catholicism in Mexico versus Catholicism in the Philippines, those cultures have different normative value systems. And so when this religion comes in, they shape it and tweak it so that it becomes the new way to enforce appropriate behavior. So the religious systems are almost invariably tied to morality. They become definers, maybe not, in some cases actually explicitly of morality, think of the Ten Commandments, but also in a rather less explicit way in terms of they are the enforcers of morality. Now, when you look at morality, there's basically two parts that to be honest, I don't remember why I put this in here. Maybe it's because it's in the text. And that's what we call generalized and situational. In some religious systems, especially universalistic religions, and especially Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the three West Asian religions, since they're all built on each other. Christianity comes out of Judaism, and Islam comes out of Christianity and Judaism. So they're all basically reinterpretations of the same sort of central beliefs. The central part of that belief system is the idea that all people are basically from one extant group, by Adam and Eve in paradise. And that because everyone's related to everyone else, then you can have a system of moral precepts or moral rules that everyone has to follow all the time. Again, the Ten Commandments and Moses and the tablet or whatever it is. So you can basically have that, for example, maybe, I don't remember what they are, maybe thou shalt not steal. Okay. And that's supposed to apply all the time. Now that's what we call generalized morality. So you don't look at it in terms of this case versus that case. You just say, did you do this when you're not supposed to? If someone says, yep, okay, well, that's bad. So that's basically a religiously driven generalized morality. Now, in a lot of areas, in a lot of religions, especially in the non-universalistic ones, but also, for example, in Buddhism, what you find is that you end up with a different way of looking at morality. Morality becomes situational. So, for example, in Taoism and Shinto, and to a certain extent, much of Asian Buddhism even, you find that if you're looking at two cases where there was theft involved, they're not going to have some sort of a umbrella thing which says all theft is bad. In those systems, what you're going to find is the belief system simply says, why did you steal? What was the purpose of the theft? Who did you steal it from? Who was it for? Who gained? Who lost? And so they're going to look at those two situations in terms of those parameters. So they're not going to say all theft is bad. They're going to say, okay, in this situation, this is what was going on. That situation, that was going on. So you're not going to be able to necessarily compare them. They're going to see as different things. In that situation, then what you find is religious belief systems tend to emphasize the fact that everything that happens is unique. It's not part of a universalistic, everything fits into one size. That's what we call situational morality. Now, the reason this becomes critical for you guys is if you move into much of the world, especially into Asia, you're going to find that much of what goes on is very much situational morality. This is also true in most of the Americas. So it doesn't matter what the universalistic religion is necessarily, it will generally support this if that's the belief system. So you have, on one hand, some parts of the world, the United States is a classic example where we judge people we don't even know. Think of social media. Someone trashing someone on Instagram or Twitter or Snapchat or something for something they said without knowing the context of it, because you're not supposed to do that. That's generalized morality. In situational morality societies, people aren't going to critique something unless they understand the context behind it. And then they're going to see that situation as being unique. It's not transferable to every other situation. It's unique to that one. And what this means is when you move to many other societies, a lot of behavior that you see might be considered, if you come from a universalistic religion, will be seen to you as being immoral or illegal or something. But that's because of your background. To the people that are actually doing it, that's not necessarily the case. If they come from a situational background, what they're doing might be perfectly legitimate and actually morally the right thing to do. And if you want an example, because I remember this from the French Revolution, you get someone who's poor and he steals a loaf of bread from a rich guy. And the reason he's doing that is because his family's starving and the loaf of bread is going to keep his kids from dying. Now, the rich guy has more bread than he knows what to do with. So in that situation, given universalistic morality or generalized morality, what that guy did was wrong. He stole a loaf of bread, and that's wrong because theft is bad. In the context of that situation, if you're looking at it from situational morality, then what the guy did was legitimate because he was saving his family. So one group, they're going to, same situation, two different ways of looking at it based on the morality logic that you have. And the belief system, the religious system will reinforce those. Okay, two basic concepts we'll sort of finish with. I'm waiting for a video to process, which I'm going to make you guys watch. In fact, we'll give you a little short one after we're done with these. And these are the idea of mana and tabu or kapu, as we call it here. Now, these are sort of confusing, especially in the context of us from here, if you know Hawaiian, because what happens in the 19th century when anthropologists get into religion, of course, they find themselves fascinated with religion. There's a huge diversity of it. It's so different from one group to another. It's like it's like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole, and you try to figure out what makes a religion work and what do people do in their religion and how does it function. So anthropologists, not surprisingly, along with kinship, find religion to be one of the major areas that they write and study. And in doing so, when they start to look at all these different religions, they realize very quickly that, and actually the Europeans are much more into this because they realize that in most European societies, they still have this as part of the religious system. In the United States, we don't, which is really, really weird. I don't understand that. It's part Anglo-American society does not have a concept of mana. And as far as I know, we might be unique in that regard. But then as you probably figured out during the semester, Anglo-American society is pretty strange. We're off on the fringe in terms of normality, in terms of the majority of the world's populations and cultures. So the idea of mana or chi, originally the Asian word would be chi. And what the anthropologists realized is despite whatever group they were looking at, a very common premise that was held in almost all these groups was that there's some sort of energy that they generally called life energy. They didn't know how else to define it. So they're looking at some way to basically put a label on that. And for some reason, I don't know why, some reason someone got hold of some text that someone had written about Hawaiian religions. And they came up and they saw the word mana and they went, oh, this term's perfect. So mana is not used by anthropologists in the sense of the Hawaiian word. It's a Hawaiian word they grabbed and turned into something else. In the same way that Xerox isn't really the company. Xerox means when you copy sheets of paper. So it got changed. So mana used by anthropology, yes, it was a Hawaiian word, but it's not being used as a Hawaiian concept. It's being used as an anthropological definition for the idea of life energy. Now, just to totally confuse yourselves, of course, that's exactly what it means in Hawaiian anyways. But it's used as a universalistic term in anthropology for the belief system that ties to life energy. In Asia, again, this is called chi. It's the same thing. Most belief systems and most groups have a concept of mana that's very central to their existence. One of the things that's really hard if you're not used to seeing it, and that's the video I'm trying to edit to show you guys, is that people don't see it as being something exotic or mysterious. I think the only time people see mana as being exotic or experienced if they're in like American society, they don't have a concept of it, then it does seem pretty trippy. If you come from a background like I do, where mana is actually part of your functional world, then you don't see it as being interesting. It's no more interesting than electricity I've got lighting the light overhead of electricity running this computer. It's just what it is. And this is the key thing to remember. When you look at the concepts of mana or chi, they're not exciting. They're just, in that belief system, they're just seen as a way that energy happens. And yes, they're related to life because things that are alive obviously have something going on. And that's called mana or chi, and that's life energy. And if you want to think about it, you actually do this in part. If you go and you get acupuncture or acupressure done, that's manipulating mana or chi points. So, but I mean, you don't think about like something exciting. It's just going in and someone's either, making your body painful with their thumbs, or they're sticking little needles on you to get rid of something. It's not considered particularly spiritual. It's just functional. So mana or chi, same concept, two different words. Use whichever one you feel more comfortable with. In anthropology, the technical term is mana. But the key thing to remember this is it's not considered as something particularly spiritual. It's considered as something that's pretty practical. In the same way that, as far as I know, I've never seen anyone go up to a Hecco electrician and burn incense in front of them and give them an offering so they make sure power goes to their house. Though, given what Hecco charges, maybe they should. But in that context, we see electricity as being, it's just a functional part of the world. I need my car, I need my phone recharged. I plug it into a computer outlet, boom, and it recharges. I don't see anything spiritual about that. It's just functionality. That's the way mana and chi are seen in societies which have them. And you see this even in contemporary Hawaiian ethnicity, because people that have Hawaiian belief systems use mana all the time, but they don't see it as something spiritual. It's just something you do. It's part of the world around you. It's functional in the same way electricity is. Mana can be broadcast. Mana can be conserved. Same way electricity is in a battery. Things can store mana. They can discharge mana in the same way that a battery discharges mana, discharges electricity. It can be used for good or bad. There's no such thing as good mana and bad mana anymore. There's good electricity and bad electricity. It just is what it is. When a battery's dead, in fact, that's an interesting term. You think about when a battery's dead, there's no electricity, which means it's inert. When something dies, the mana has left it, and it's inert. And a lot of stuff on the planet can't absorb things. They're not batteries, so they're not going to have mana. They're just objects. Other things can. Now, where it gets very complicated, and Hawaii is a good example. This is an example, but I'll just give it to you. And we'll say that this particular rock, and in Hawaii, depending on where you are and what you are, this particular rock could be seen as having mana. And what that means is, even though this looks like a rock in the Western sense, in a Hawaiian or in many other societies' contexts, especially in Asia, for example, this rock could actually be seen as a battery. It can actually store mana or chi, which also means in the right situation, you could somehow use that rock and take some of the mana or chi out of it. So this is one of the areas where the idea of inert and alive varies tremendously from group to group. In Hawaiian belief systems still today, a lot of things actually have mana in them, including not the mist in Palolo, but the mist that comes down in Manoa, for example, that sort of brushes across you. That is actually seen as having mana. It's seen as actually being alive. Now, it's of interest that the Hawaiians did not have a concept that the mist in Palolo was alive. That's just the Manoa mist that's alive. So in that context, one was alive. The other was just seen as a physical manifestation. It was just moisture coming out of the air. So from group to group, what they see as having life energy and how it's exhibited and how is going to vary tremendously. And in Hawaiian system, as in many belief systems, it's largely intuitive. You feel something has life energy in it. So that's mana. What you find in societies which have mana very frequently is going to be a system of controls about who can access that energy. In other words, who can tap that battery, how you put energy into the battery. So if we're talking about mana, since it's life energy, one of the things, of course, is this explains sorcery or magic. Magic is the manipulation of mana. And if you're doing killing magic, like some of the Tongas did here back in pre-European period, what that meant is they had the ability through various sets of skills to basically suck the mana out of someone. And of course, when you've taken the mana out, that person dies. They have no more life energy in them. In the same way, if someone was a kahuna lapa'au, their job was to basically put energy into people, put mana into people to make them more healthy. But the thing was, is people didn't see them as magicians or sorcerers. People just saw them as functional specialists who knew how to do something that other people didn't know how to do. So it wasn't that they were like what Harry Potter's witches or something like that. I assume Harry Potter was a witch. But they were seen as being something part of everyday life. If you were sick, you wanted to, tonga lapao to get healed. And they would do various things. And if they just say, I can or I can't. Okay, the same way you can go to a doctor now, I need to get fixed. And they go, I can or I can't. Okay. So there's not necessarily the idea of the exotic or mysterious. It's not, incense, dark rooms, and people wearing weird outfits or something like that. That's very much sort of a Hollywood or Western stereotype. In the system of mana, then, if you want controls over that, then you're going to have rules for who accesses this stuff, when they access it, and what conditions they do that under. Those originally are, then again, the word taboo comes again from the other Hawaiian word they picked up when they grabbed this stuff, and the Anglo, European thing. They saw the word kapu, which was usually being written taboo at that time, T-A-B-U, I think. And they decided, oh, this is a really good other term to explain this other part of this idea of mana, basically the controls of access to mana. And so they called that taboo. Now that very quickly hopped, much more so than mana when you think about it. The word taboo very quickly hopped into English as a regular, very common term for a whole mess of stuff. In fact, one of the students I think a couple of years ago mentioned there's actually a perfume called Taboo. I have no idea what that would be about. When you think about it, it's sort of odd that you'd have a term that says kapu on something you put on your body, and then you want people to like you. Unless maybe they're perfumes to keep people away. I don't know, whatever. You can go over research that in your spare time. So this is the idea of taboo. The idea of taboo is basically rules or regulations to control behavior, but it's usually originally tied to the idea of mana or chi. Now again, in the popular American form of the word, it becomes things you're not supposed to do, like incest taboo. But that's actually not part of what it originally, the concept was. The original concept, even in anthropology, was related to this idea of mana. It's part of a link set, if you want. Okay. Now with that, let's go take a look at something. So we'll finish this off and making you guys think a little bit. Hopefully you guys, there it goes. Now here we have something that's very British. It's only found in certain parts of England. To be honest, I don't know exactly where it's found. I think it's in the north central part. Feel free to Google this and do some research on it. It's called Morris dancing. Now this goes way, way back. This is a Celtic thing. This goes very much pre-Christian. So way before Christianity showed up, way before the Romans showed up, as far as we can tell, people were doing this. So this is part of a ritual belief system originally. Now I don't know what the Brits use it for now. I think it's used as sort of a exotic, this group doing something weird. Maybe this is their version of the Polynesian Cultural Center or something. I don't know, hula performance. I have no idea. But just watch a minute of this. Remember, this is a ritual performance. This originally was done for the purpose of acquiring mana. So this, if you want to, this is a mana dance. Now, if you're an anthropologist seeing this for the first time, one is you got to think these outfits are pretty trippy. Secondly is if you notice there's a lot of stuff here that gives you a hint that somehow it's tied to ritual and very, very possibly into mana. If you think about these guys have bells, or I don't know what you call these things on their legs. So they're making a lot of noise when they dance around. And the noise that they're making is tied to the dancing. It's a very ritualized performance. These guys are very much doing a very specific pattern of moves. They're banging the sticks to each other. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here, which is very highly ritualized. This is very typical of what you're going to see in belief systems, i.e. religious systems. So this originally was a belief ritual performance. And I don't know if this still has a ritual function. I believe that it used to be tied to either spring or summer solstice. I don't remember what, but it was tied to basically springtime, as I remember. So it had something to do with the world changing into a time of growth. And that might be why they have the flowers and the hats and stuff. I suspect the actual outfits are probably from the 19th century because they sort of look very 19th century or maybe earlier. It's very possible these guys were dressed very, very differently, if anything, back if it was part of a Druidic or Celtic ceremony, pre-Roman, pre-Christian. Now, what says something really interesting, of course, this is from, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. So we're talking about 21st century England, which is a Christian country, and in various ways, Anglican Church is the big player there. So what you've got is a society which has very little tie to whatever this originally was a part of, but they still do it. And I have a deep sneaking suspicion that you'd find that some of these people that do it, either the performers, the people watching, or someone here, there's people that are still doing it for ritual purposes. For the rest of the population, I suspect this is probably seen as something exotic that locals do in this part of England. But you don't find Morris dancing in Scotland. It's not in Ireland. It's not in Wales. It's a particularly British thing. The Welsh have their own set of things they do, and the Scots have a ton of stuff, and the Irish do also, that predates Christianity and the formation of the United Kingdom, etc. And this is very typical of religion, because remember what I said is religion's based on beliefs, and beliefs are something you carry in your head. If you have a belief that something like this is still legit and important, then you're going to keep it up. You just make sure you practice it when the new religion guys aren't around. And my suspicion would be in the 17 and 1800s, when there was a lot less tolerance of anything other than sort of mainstream Anglican Christianity in England, that this was heavily discouraged. But that doesn't mean it wasn't done. So this is a good example of something that if you're thinking of mainstream religion, a class, say, of a religion class, this wouldn't fit. It's not part of a modern theological system. It might not even have a theology attached to it anymore. But at least for some people that are involved in it, it's probably still very much a part of their belief system that ties to their explanations or reasons for things that are above observation. So it is part of, to an anthropologist, this is part of a religion. Now notice how what this means is it's part of an older religion that's still stacked on top of a newer religion, which is part of a very complex system that these folks that call themselves Brits have as part of their belief system. So this is why anthropologists study religion the way we study it. Because at some point, these guys their outfits might look odd. What they're doing might look pretty strange. But on the other hand, from an anthropological standpoint, our job would be to try to explain not only what they're doing, but why they're doing it, what does it mean to them. And also to a certain extent, you have to remember you've got three groups here. You've got the people dancing, you've got the people playing the music and watching who know what's going on. And you've also got, at least to me, like a group of tourists. So you've actually got 3 or 4 different groups. You got to figure out what are they all getting out of this? What does it all mean to them? And so if you think about it, this actually goes back to the tourism stuff we were just looking at. I can guarantee Morris dancing is a tourist attraction in parts of England, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily why the people are doing it, that are actually the performers, or what the logic is. Okay. So it's sort of a good way to sort of segue out of that. So we'll stop with this idea of mana and taboo, but we'll just sort of finish it with this idea of the Morris dance, which is a fascinating example of a persistent pattern of beliefs in a modern, very contemporary, major sort of world society.